Hey, welcome everybody. Especially want to say welcome to you if you're hanging out with us online at mochurch.tv. Go ahead and grab your Bibles and open up to Proverbs chapter 14. My name's Curtis. I'm our Twinsburg, Macedonia campus minister. Here's the deal. We're going to start out in Proverbs chapter 14 today. If you don't have a Bible that you feel like you can read and understand, snag one of the paperback Bibles at the ends of the rows. And seriously, feel free to take one of those suckers home with you. Make it yours. All the page numbers you see on the screen are going to correspond to that paperback house Bible. If you're hanging out with us online, open up another web browser and go to BibleGateway.com. We'll be using the NIV version today. So we're going to cover a couple different scriptures. And as we kind of talk about something that I think really affects every single one of us, and I think it affects us probably in more ways than we really are able to realize. And so as much as I can, I would really encourage you to open a note section on your phone or get your cameras ready to snap some pictures of the verses that we're going to go through, because we have some really practical applications out of today that I think you could go home and begin implementing that will make a significant difference with something that I think we all have a little bit of a problem with. So today we are closing out 2018 Momentum at the Movies, and so it's been a good one. Today we are talking about the movie A Quiet Place. So by round of applause, how many of you have seen the movie A Quiet Place? Okay, all right. So this was a good movie. This was a good kind of like surprise film for me. I was immediately intrigued just by simply seeing the trailer on the premise of the movie. So here's the deal. The premise of the movie, it's like a suspense film, a horror film. I don't know like which genre like it actually fits in, or really what the difference is necessarily between the two. But the premise of the movie is this. The setting is a post-apocalyptic setting where we're not exactly sure what has happened. There's something that's happened to the world, and we're not sure how these creatures have gotten there, but the world is full of blind, alien-like creatures that have supersonic hearing. And these creatures, they attack anything that makes any sort of noise, and they try to eliminate the noise. Anything that makes the slightest amount of sound, with ferocious violence and swiftness, they attack the sound to eliminate the sound. And so everything in the movie is quiet. Everywhere. Everyone is quiet. They do everything they can to eliminate even the slightest of sounds. Within their houses, they go and they actually paint the spots of the floor that it is okay to step on so that the floor doesn't creak. When they walk outside and they go from house to town or to the store or something like that, they actually take bags of white sand and pour the sand out so that they can walk on the sand to keep from kicking gravel or crunching leaves as they walk. And so there's not a whole lot that we know as like the movie opens. There's not a whole lot that we know about the creatures, but there's a couple things that we know for sure. Number one, there are a lot of these creatures, these alien-like creatures that love to eliminate sound with supersonic hearing. There are a lot of them. You don't hardly ever see them, but you know that they're there, just kind of hiding just beyond where you can see, camouflaged in the woods and behind other places. They're blind. They cannot see anything. And the other thing that we know is that they swiftly and violently move to eliminate any form of sound, whether that's a person or an object causing the noise. And we learn a couple other things as the movie goes on, but I'm not going to tell you what those are this morning because we like to try and avoid spoilers here at Momentum at the Movies. But the opening scene of the movie sets up a subplot and really kind of becomes a sub-theme throughout the movie, and it's something that I think we need to talk about. In the opening scene, the movie opens, and the Abbott family is on a supply run into town. And the Abbott family is led by the husband named Lee, played by Jim from The Office. I can't help but wonder where like Dwight is, but... So the opening scene is that they are in a convenience store, and inside this convenience store, they are looking for different things they need throughout the house. And the dad happens to see his youngest son discover a toy rocket ship. Now, the youngest boy in the family just happens to love rockets. We find out quickly that that's all he seems to talk about right now are rocket ships. And while in this convenience store, he finds a rocket ship complete with lights and sounds, which could be a big problem. Now the dad, Lee, played by Jim, just so happens to see the youngest boy find the rocket ship, and in enough time to run to him, take the ship from him, and take the batteries out of the toy rocket ship. And when he takes the batteries out of the toy rocket ship, he sets them up on the counter, and he gets down on one knee, and he says to him in sign language, "It's too loud, I'm sorry." And you can tell that the boy is brokenhearted about it, but he kind of understands, like, Dad says no, so it's no. And so the dad, after he signs to him, "Hey, it's too loud," and he leaves the rocket ship and the batteries up on the counter, and the dad turns and he leaves the convenience store. The mom follows after suit, and then the older brother, and it's left with just his oldest sister, Reagan, and the youngest brother, the boy who loves the rocket ships. Now, Reagan, as a good older daughter, as an older sister, knows how much her younger brother loves rocket ships, and she hates seeing him brokenhearted. And knowing that the batteries have been taken out of the rocket ship, she doesn't see any harm in him still having it. And so she takes the rocket ship off the counter, and she hands it to her younger brother, turns, and leaves. And then you see the younger brother kind of taking a moment, and he realizes he's got a decision to make. Sister turns the corner, he sees her, and he looks back at the batteries, and he looks at the ship, and he looks at the batteries, and he looks at the ship, and he snags the batteries off the counter, shoves them in his pocket, hides the rocket ship underneath of his vest, and walks out of the store. And the family is walking back to their home, and we got a picture for you, and you can see, I don't know if you can see this, but you can actually see the sand trail that they would walk on to keep from crunching the leaves. And so they would walk in a single file line. And the older brother was really tired, so the dad was carrying him, and he's walking up front, and and then the mom was following behind, and then we have Reagan, then we have the youngest boy, and you can see that he's hiding the rocket ship underneath of his vest. And as he's walking, eventually curiosity gets the best of him. And they come right to a bridge, and the youngest boy at the back of the line, decides to take the rocket ship out of his vest and inserts batteries into the rocket ship, causing it to light up, and immediately the sounds begin to play. And so the dad, Lee, he turns on a dime, sets down the older brother, and begins to sprint back to try and get to the youngest brother in order to separate him from the ship before the creatures are able to come and eliminate the sound. And they don't show you anything. The scene cuts too quickly, but with the very next scene, you know that the youngest brother has been killed. And we think, man, this is an awesome beginning to a sermon. Now, the movie immediately jumps to a year later, and something's different. It's not different with the world. They're still all completely quiet. It's still evident that the creatures are all still there, and it's still very evident that the boy is gone. But something is different among the relationships, specifically the relationship between the dad and the daughter Reagan. And you can't tell for sure what is different, but you can tell that there's something not right between them. They're around each other, they're interacting with each other as if everything is okay, but something's off, and we as the viewers, we can't really tell what it is because no one's talking about it. Everything is quiet. And this kind of goes on, and they'll interact with each other, but you can tell something's wrong. And about 2/3 of the way through the film, the older brother, the brother who survived, ends up on a food run with his dad. And they sit down, and we're going to talk about the rest of this conversation at the end of the sermon. But as they're sitting there alongside this brook where they're gathering some trout, the older brother says to the dad, just kind of out of nowhere, because they were just sitting there in silence, says, "Dad, do you blame her?" And they have this real quick conversation between the two of them. And what you realize as the viewer very quickly from this conversation is that each person in the movie, each person as a member of that family, is dealing with some different form of resentment. And the dad's dealing with all kinds of resentment. He's dealing with resentment that it happened. He's dealing with resentment that he didn't just throw the batteries away when he took them out of the rocket ship. He's dealing with resentment that he was walking in the front of the line instead of the back of the line so he could watch that everything was going on. You learn from the mom was dealing with resentment that she wasn't carrying the younger brother. You learn that the sister was dealing with resentment that she gave him the rocket ship. And so resentment all of a sudden becomes and plays a big part of this film. And another word that goes right alongside with resentment, I think the two in some ways go hand in hand, is this word bitterness. And as I was watching this movie and as these two kind of had this conversation, I couldn't help but think about this verse from Proverbs chapter 14 that reads like this. Proverbs 14:10 says, "Each heart knows its own bitterness, and no one else can share its joy." This phrase right here, no one else, some translations will translate it, no one else can fully share its joy. No one else can understand. Like, you don't know what it is that I have been through. You don't know what it is that I felt. You don't know what they did to me. And this word right here, this part of the Bible was written in ancient Hebrew. And this word that gets translated bitterness is this word that's pronounced marah. Marah. Now this has nothing to do with like the etymology of the word or how we translate the word, but when I found that out, it was extremely memorable for me because that's exactly how bitterness or resentment makes us feel, right? When we get hurt, when we get wounded, we feel exposed, we feel raw. And so the thing that we want to do is we want to bury it. We want to cover it over. We want to pretend like it's not there. We just want this hurt to go away. We want this memory to disappear. And so what we do is we tend to bury it and think, you know what? I'll just pretend that it's not there. I won't acknowledge it. And I assume that it will just go away without me ever having to do anything with it, without ever causing any other issues. And so we bury it. Our bitterness, our resentment. But here's the thing about resentment, here's the thing about bitterness, is bitterness grows best when it's buried. Bitterness grows best when it's buried. This could be a promotion as someone else gets that you feel like you deserved. It could be someone who took advantage of trust that you had in a relationship. It could be something that happened to a loved one or maybe even to yourself. That's really, it wasn't your fault. A diagnosis, an accident. And what tends to happen is we hold on to these things and we hate how exposed we feel and we hate how angry it is that they make us because it's not fair. And so we don't talk about them because no one else could ever understand. You don't know what it is that I've been through. No one else could fully share the joy, the hurt, of the bitterness. And there's a lot of truth in that. There's a lot of application that we're going to take from today, and ultimately what we're going to be leading to is this idea of forgiveness. And we've done a couple series specifically on forgiveness, and one of the things that we always stress, and I think this is so important for you to hear before we go any further on talking about how we can handle our bitterness and resentment is, I know that I don't know your pain. I know that I don't fully know the bitterness that you have experienced. I know that I don't fully know the resentment that is caused because of that thing that they did to you or that thing that you experienced that one time. I know that I don't know that pain, but I do know the pain and anger and poison that carrying bitterness around can bring into your life and spread into other relationships. And so it is so important for us to root out bitterness in our lives. Another place in the Bible actually uses the metaphor of a root for bitterness. Hebrews 12:15 says this, "Watch out that no poisonous root of bitterness grows up to trouble you, corrupting many." Now, the author of this book in the Bible, Hebrews, here specifically is talking about believing lies about Jesus. Hey, be careful that you know and you study and you learn who Jesus is and you don't believe some lies because that'll be root that'll grow up and it'll cause problems. But this metaphor of bitterness being a root makes sense to us. Right? Because bitterness grows beneath the surface. It grows beneath the surface and it causes more issues over time. It spreads. And resentment is the same way. It grows beneath the surface. And if it ever shows itself, if it ever comes to the surface, it shows itself as anger, typically towards another person who didn't cause the problem in the first place. And roots are a pain in the butt, aren't they? Anybody else ever had to like dig up roots on a place where you're going to make a garden, or you're like getting rid of a tree from your house? They are a pain in the rear end, especially the longer they've had to grow. I'm going to give you an example. About 4 years ago, my wife and we bought a house in Macedonia. And the house was built in 92. And one of the best things you could do to like raise the value of your home, like right as you're selling it, is to improve the landscaping, make the landscaping on the outside look really good. And so typically, a lot of times what contractors will do when they finish the work on the house is they'll spend a bunch of money to do really good landscaping. And they will bring in like young trees and stuff and plant them in bushes and plant them around the house so people see it and they're like, oh, this looks awesome. Here, take all my money, you know. And so what they did, or at least what I think happened, is they brought in this house that we bought, they put in 5 little evergreen trees right in front of the garage. And then right on the corner of the garage, they put this, imagining at the time, this little red Japanese maple tree. And I know that you have wondered this at some point in time. My absolute favorite tree is a red Japanese maple tree. Yeah, I didn't realize you could have one of those, but I do. And so now for all of you who's wondering, I wonder what Curtis's favorite tree is. It's the red Japanese maple. So now you know. And at the corner of the garage, they planted this red Japanese maple tree. It probably looked awesome in 1992 when the house was built. And they were not at all concerned what it would look like 20 years from now. Because when we bought the house, now these evergreen trees are towering over our garage, and the red Japanese maple tree is also doing the same. And they planted all of these 5 evergreen trees less than a foot away from the foundation of the garage. And so the roots are beginning to grow into the foundation. This red Japanese maple tree, they planted less than a foot and a half away from the foundation of the garage. I got up onto the house to put up Christmas lights later that year, and I found out that the evergreen trees were actually growing into the shingles of the garage and beginning to pull the gutters off the side of the garage. So it's like, all right, these suckers got to go. Same thing with the red Japanese maple, beginning to pull the gutters off the tree, which I was really sad about because it is my favorite tree. But it's got to go. It's causing problems. So later in the spring, I got the chainsaw, zip, 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 cut all those suckers down, cut the red Japanese maple down, moment of silence. And then I had to deal with the trunks and the roots of the trees. Now, my family and I, we don't exactly fit into the neighborhood we live in. We're just a little bit more country. And so my dad has a Kubota tractor, and I just, because he lives across the street, it's an everybody loves Raymond situation. I walked over there, I borrow his Kubota tractor, and I get his chain, and I dig around these stumps, and the evergreen stumps and roots, they come out no problem. But this Japanese red maple tree was just an entirely different story. And so I begin excavating around this thing, and I get the chain up underneath of it, and I tie it to the back of the tractor, and what you do is then you just kind of pull it, and you just give that tractor everything she's got and just hope you can yank it out of there. Well, I'm giving it everything she's got, and that stump ain't even budging. So you know what you do when that happens? You back up a little bit further, and you crank up the RPMs, you get a little bit more of a running start, and you know, like a chain yanking. So I'm on this Kubota tractor riding it like a bucking bronco, you know, in my front yard. My dad's cheering me on. You got it, Curtis. Neighbors are stopping like, what the heck is happening, you know? And eventually we get the stump out of there, but the problem is outside of the stump comes out, but in the ground still is a root that is bigger and thicker than the actual stump is. And now because the stump is gone, I can't use the tractor anymore. I still have to get this root out of there. So I grab the pickaxe, the shovel, and a pair of gloves, and I go to work with my hands. And as I'm working this thing and I'm grabbing it, and eventually I get it to the point where I'm able to like get my hands around and pull up the root, it tracks all around the garden and to a bush. So I've already lost these evergreen trees, which I liked, and my red Japanese maple, which I loved. And this bush that I still wanted to keep was over 15 feet away in a straight line. And as I pulled the root up, I found out that the end of that root actually grew into the roots of that bush, and pulling up that root meant that I lost the other bush that I loved. And so all of this devastation comes because I let the roots grow. And in the heat of the sun, no longer able to use the tractor and all that, I couldn't think about how difficult this work was, and then I couldn't think about anything else besides how strikingly similar the hard work it is that we have to do in order to fix relationships when we allow bitterness and resentment to grow beneath the surface. To the point where the roots grow and they run and they spread to other things that had absolutely nothing to do with where the plant started. And so I kept coming back to this phrase that I've started to use to talk about why it's so important to root out the root of bitterness, and that is that roots run. Especially with bitterness, especially with resentment. Man, the roots run and they spread, and they cause damage in places that you didn't even see coming, and problems in ways that you never imagined. You see, what's underneath, it can hurt and it can continue to grow, and eventually it will wreak havoc in other relationships in your life. See, in the movie, the resentment didn't show up and it didn't seem to cause a problem at first. In fact, everything seemed okay. They were still interacting, like it was all right. Something was off, but it's like, we'll just kind of like move on from it, assume it's all good. And no one ever addressed what had happened on that day until that time where the brother was sitting down with his dad. Everyone was silent. Everyone just kept quiet. And they just seemed to move on from it. But that is exactly what let the roots grow. By not addressing it directly, the dad seemingly stopped saying, "I love you," and the daughter stopped believing it. See, the problem with bitterness or resentment is it usually shows up in one or two ways. Bitterness or resentment will show up in ways that keeps you from or causes you to. Example, bitterness will keep you from expressing love that is felt, even if there is some anger or disappointment in the relationship. Bitterness will keep you from expressing forgiveness, setting the table for you to not be able to forgive yourself when you mess up in a relationship. Bitterness will keep you from experiencing the joy of relationships that are worth having and keep you stuck in a prison of self. Resentment will cause you to pull away and not trust. Resentment will build anger that will eventually pour out in a way that is not healthy and probably on someone that it is not meant for. Resentment will cause you to feel weak and hurt in ways that will affect other relationships. It shows up in ways that keeps you from and causes you to. And over the last several months in my own personal Bible reading, I kept coming back to this idea of how important it is for us to root out resentment in our lives. And one of the guys who used to go to my Mo group, I know this isn't original with him, but he said it to me. He's the first one that said it to me, and so it's really stuck out, and I've always attributed it to him. And it's that resentment always rots the container that holds it. That's why it's so important for us to handle this. Because resentment rots the container that holds it. And who's the one who's typically holding it when we're dealing with it? Us. And so this is something we all have to deal with, right? This isn't a Christian thing. This is just a thing. This is a life thing. Whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, whether you're a Christian or not, you know that you have resentment or bitterness that causes problems for you personally as well as in other relationships. And so this isn't just a Christian thing. This is something we need to learn and benefit from regardless of what we think about Jesus. But here's the cool thing. A guy named Paul, who was not a follower of Jesus but eventually becomes a follower of Jesus, gives us some really practical stuff on how we can root out bitterness and resentment and make our relationships better. And so a guy named Paul, he eventually writes this letter that we have in our Bibles known as the book of Ephesians. And in this letter, we're going to read 3 short verses, but I want to kind of give you a context of what he's writing. And so just before these 3 verses we're going to read, Paul writes this. He says, look, people who aren't following God, this is Curtis Teel's summation, so this isn't thus saith the Lord. This is my interpretation of it. Paul says this. He says, look, people who aren't following God, man, they give in to their greed. It's normal for them to look out for themselves. It's normal for them to get revenge. It's normal for them to take what they feel like is theirs and give completely into their greed. That's what's normal, but normal isn't working. Because look at them. They're still bitter in life. But following Jesus' teachings is different. And you've already experienced the joy that comes from living out Jesus' teachings. So keep doing what Jesus would have you do in your relationships. That's Curtis Teel's version. And then Paul says this in verse 25 of chapter 4. He says, therefore, because normal's not working, because everybody else buries it and pretends like it's not there, and that doesn't work, we need to do something different. Therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor. For we are all members of one body. In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. Here in these 3 verses, I think Paul gives us 3 very practical things to help us root out bitterness in our lives. And I want you to write them down because I think you can go home and begin implementing them right now. And the first is, don't give the bitter thought a foothold, or the way I would say it, don't give the bitter thought a place to live. That word foothold is actually translated as living space. Another way that it's translated on some occasions is this idea of sanctuary. And what's a sanctuary? A sanctuary is a safe space. And Paul says, hey, look, here's the deal. You're going to experience bitterness. You're going to experience injustices that are not fair. They're not right. And they are going to tempt you to make you bitter. Don't give it safe space in your mind. Do not give that bitter thought a safe place to live in your mind, because that's really Satan. And he will use that space that you give him to grow more bitterness in you and to rob you of the joy and freedom that God wants you to experience in your life. See, just like trying to dig up a tree and its roots, this is extremely difficult. I mean, there is a lot of hard work. There is a lot of rawness that comes with this. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of commitment. It takes a lot of energy to dive into problems where bitterness and resentment have begun to grow. We've done a series twice now that we call F-Bomb, all about forgiveness. And one of the things that we talked about in the series is how important it is for us to release our hope for a better past. It's so important for us to release our hope for a better past. You see, whatever has caused your resentment, whatever has caused your bitterness, it's okay to wish that didn't happen. But when that becomes your sole focus, but when you let that sit and you spend more time wishing that it didn't happen rather than jumping in and dealing with it, you are letting the roots grow and you are robbing yourself of a better future. So don't give it a safe place to live in your mind. Which means, and points us to what Paul says in the second verse, or the second part, is don't give the bitter thought too much time. You see, when he says there in Ephesians 4, do not let the sun go down on your anger, we often hear that phrase brought up and talked about in the context of marriage. Don't go to bed while you're angry with each other. Hey, when you fight, don't go to bed when you're angry. That's usually where we hear it, is in the context of marriage, and that's good, and it definitely fits there. But when you look at what Paul's talking about, the context is actually all relationships in general. In fact, when you spread out chapter 4 even more, he's specifically talking about here within the church. He's saying, man, don't give Satan a foothold. Don't get bitter and resentful towards each other, especially towards each other. Don't let a bitter root start to grow within Momentum. Don't let a bitter root begin to grow within his church. It says bitterness is like a weed, And there's just something about weeds that they just seem to grow so much faster than everything else, right? Or am I the only one who has that problem? It's like I sit down and like when I ever actually take the time to weed, I have like one of those like special weed picks, and I'll go like, boop, like, yes, I got the root. And I like turn around and it's already back. It's like, what the heck? I can't get tomatoes to grow, but I can sure grow weeds with the best of them. See, Paul's making a point here to not let bitterness sit around for a while. Because the longer you give it, the bigger and deeper the roots grow, causing more problems in other relationships. Why? Because the roots run. See, and there's this thing, like we do have to have a balance with this. I know some of you are like, yes, I'm so glad he's talking about this. I already know what we're talking about on the way home. You need to put it on pause. See, some of us, man, we are willing to jump right into difficult conversations and say, you know what, I'm going to say right what's on my mind and I'll deal with the consequences later. You need to pause. But there are some of us, like, man, we avoid difficult conversations, just with everything. We would rather be anywhere else. And neither of those are our best option. We need to recognize that talking to the person who caused our bitterness can bring peace, or at least can begin to bring healing. And so before you jump into this conversation, you need to remember this proverb: the words of the reckless pierce like swords, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. And so before you jump into this conversation, is your goal to get on the other side and have healing for the both of you, or all of you, or just you? Because if you're the only one who wants to come out feeling good on the other side, or at least beginning to experience healing, then you're probably not really ready to have the conversation. The other thing that I fully recognize is it may not be a good thing for you to go to the person who has caused the resentment or bitterness in your life and talk to them about it. That may not be the best person, but you still cannot give the bitter thought a foothold, and you still can't give it too much time. You need to go talk to a counselor. I'm telling you from my own personal experience as someone who still actively right now goes and talks to a counselor to deal with bitterness and resentment, you have got to go talk to somebody. I've got resources, I've got numbers, I can pass you the information. Do not let bitterness have a safe space to live in your mind. And that leads us to Paul's final application, which he says in verse 25. He says this. He says, stop lying and speak truthfully to your neighbor. And the way I would say it is, address the bitterness honestly. Address the bitterness honestly. See, for us, Paul heightens the importance of us addressing it. In the book, 12 Rules for Life, written by a clinical psychologist named Jordan Peterson, this book, each chapter is a suggested rule for life and the psychology behind why this would be a good rule to adopt and live out in your life. And rule number 8 is this: always tell the truth, or at least don't lie. And the chapter goes on to talk about how important it is to be honest when something upsets you or when something hurts you. And he says, because if we lie about it and we shrug it off like it's no big deal, not only does that breed resentment in you, but then you actually become an active participant in letting it happen, which leads you to becoming bitter towards yourself. And so Paul challenges us to do the same thing that psychology experts are telling us to do, and that is address it honestly. See, in the movie, what causes separation between the father and the daughter, it goes unaddressed for a long time. It allows the roots to grow, and it allows the roots to run. And then eventually, the older brother who survives and the dad, they sit down for this conversation that I told you about. And the son breaks the silence as they're just kind of sitting there. They're able to talk because they're sitting next to a waterfall, and it causes more noise, so they're actually able to speak with each other. And as they're sitting there in silence with just the waterfall in the background, the boy turns to him and he says to his dad, "Dad, do you blame her? Do you blame her for what happened?" And the dad sits there for a little bit and he kind of stares into his hands, and you can almost see him beginning just to replay the tapes and what he wishes he would have done differently that day. And the son breaks the silence and he goes, "Because she blames herself." And so the dad at this point, he just puts his head down, and then the son says to his dad, well, Dad, do you love her? And the dad looks up kind of like perplexed and looks back and goes, of course. And the son says, well, you should tell her because she doesn't think you do anymore. You see, the ironic thing is when this thing gets fully explored, come to find out, the father isn't bitter at the daughter at all. He just wasn't sure how to address it. He hated that the whole thing happened, and he just wanted it to go away, so he buried it, and the rest of the family followed his lead. But by not addressing it, it allowed the bitterness to grow and into something, and for someone it was never meant to affect. And it caused problems with his daughter and the other relationships. See, bitterness and resentment happen for a reason, oftentimes because of an injustice that we or someone else we love experiences. And the problem is not the anger we have about that. The problem is keeping it quiet. Because see, denial breeds resentment, and resentment always rots the container that holds it. And so Paul says, address it. Address it. Address it quickly. And don't you dare give it a safe place to live in your mind. Let's pray. God, we love you. God, thank you for loving us. God, thanks for this wisdom. God, thanks for understanding that things about us that we don't even understand about ourselves. How resentment can exist beneath the surface, and it looks like just this little thing, but these roots run all over the place. God, give us wisdom on how to root this out in our lives so that we can experience the forgiveness and joy and hope that you want us to experience for ourselves and in our relationships. God, give us wisdom on how we can talk about it, when we can talk about it. Give us the right words to say when we begin to talk about it. God, and help us to be able to root this out in our lives. God, it is in your Son's holy and awesome name we pray and who we cling to hope with, Jesus. God, thank you. Amen.